edit the video afterwards.
All right. So the general title of this event is Political Abuse of Psychiatry. The title of my talk is on human organ transplants abuse. So superficially, the two topics appear different. One relates to mental abuse, the other relates to physical abuse. The question I had to address in developing this presentation is what, if any, is the connection between the two topics? That question led me to 8 subordinate questions. 2 questions address the connection between victimization and abuse. Does political abuse of psychiatry lead to organ transplant abuse? Does organ transplant abuse lead to political abuse of psychiatry? 2 other questions address the effect of opposition to either abuse. Does opposition to organ transplant abuse lead to political abuse of psychiatry? Does opposition to a political abuse of psychiatry lead to organ transplant abuse? 2 further questions address the relationship between the professions. To what extent should psychiatrists work to end organ transplant abuse? To what extent should transplant professionals work to end political abuse of psychiatry? And the last 2 questions address the lessons to be learned from combating each abuse. What can those combating organ transplant abuse learn from the effort to combat political abuse of psychiatry? What can those combating political abuse of psychiatry learn from the effort to combat organ transplant abuse? So I'm going to address each of these 8 questions in turn. In addressing these 8 questions, I will use China as a case study, since China presents both organ transplant abuse and political abuse of psychiatry. So the first question was this: does political abuse of psychiatry lead to organ transplant abuse? To answer this question, it requires consideration of the procedures by which organ transplant abuse in China with prisoners of conscience victims occur. I wonder if you'll just excuse me for a second. I'm going to close a window. There's planes flying overhead that cause a noise. Just give me a second. There we go. The government of China, through its prison detention centers and hospitals, has engaged in the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs, primarily practitioners of Falun Gong since the early 2000s, and also in large numbers since 2017, the Uyghurs. Tibetans and House Christians, primarily Eastern Lightning or the Almighty House of God, have been victims in lesser number. For Falun Gong experience is this. Falun Gong is a Chinese equivalent to yoga, a modern blending of traditional Chinese spiritual beliefs and exercises. Begun in 1992 with the teachings of Li Hongzhi. Originally encouraged by the Chinese government as beneficial to health, Falun Gong grew from a standing start in 1992 to an estimated 70 to 100 million practitioners by 1999. 70 million was the government estimate, 100 million was the practitioner estimate. Falun Gong practitioners engaged in exercises publicly in groups. Public exercises were visible everywhere in China. There were 3,000 Falun Gong exercise stations in Beijing alone. The Chinese Communist Party, seeing Falun Gong everywhere and fearing for its own popularity and ideological supremacy, decided to suppress the practice as a party decision without a legislative or regulatory ban. The repression led to a great deal of incomprehension. Practitioners could not see the harm to the government or the party in a set of healthful exercises. The repression led to massive demonstrations with banners and posters saying Falun Gong is good. as if the Communist Party had mistakenly been led into thinking that Falun Gong was bad or harmful. Practitioners failed to realize that the very fact that Falun Gong was good, or at least seemed so to the practitioners, was what led to its downfall. The party does not fear losing support to the bad, only the good represents a real challenge to party supremacy. Be that as it may, the party arrested the demonstrators in the millions. They were kept in detention in makeshift detention camps all over China. They were tortured into signing documents renouncing Falun Gong, denouncing their fellow practitioners, and embracing the party. And if they did so, they were released. Hundreds of thousands, high hundreds of thousands, refused to sign these documents, even under torture. So they remained in arbitrary, indefinite detention, engaged in forced labor. The detained practitioners were systematically, periodically blood tested and organ examined. The blood and tissue type information elicited from these tests was circulated to local transplant hospitals and transplant wings of general hospitals. And Falun Gong was everywhere, and so the detentions were everywhere, and these hospitals doing transplants were, of course, everywhere also in China. Chinese hospitals advertised aggressively worldwide for transplant patients, offering organs on demand, booked in advance of even vital organs. Patients could pay the hospitals and doctors a predetermined price, paid typically in cash in red envelopes. When a patient showed up, the hospitals would determine the blood and tissue type of the patient, match the typing with the information supplied from the local detention center or prison, and dispatch a white van to fetch the organ. The detained Falun Gong practitioner with a matching organ would be brought to a holding cell in the place of detention and injected with muscle relaxants and anticoagulants. Once immobilized through injection, the practitioner would then be brought to the white van and the organ on order would be extracted. The practitioner would die through the organ extraction. The body would be cremated at a crematorium at the prisoner detention center grounds. The white van would transport the organ to the hospital for insertion in the patient. Coincident with organ transplant abuse in China with Falun Gong victims has been political abuse of psychiatry, also with Falun Gong victims. Falun Gong practitioners were arbitrarily detained in psychiatric facilities, as well as Communist Party detention facilities and prisons. But the numbers were, of course, a lot smaller. Given the number of Falun Gong who opposed the repression compared to the size of psychiatric facilities, it was possible to detain only a small portion of Falun Gong practitioners in these facilities. The question became why any of them were detained at all. Mental health was not an issue. Detention in psychiatric facilities occurred only for the purpose of repression. How was repression assisted by this particular form of repression of a relatively small number of practitioners? In absolute numbers, the figures might seem large, in the thousands, yet the numbers were tiny compared to the overall detained population, which, as I mentioned, was in the high hundreds of thousands. Well, in the millions, if you count those that were eventually released. The reason for this particular form of detention, psychiatric, appears to be that psychiatric detention advanced the propaganda aim of the Communist Party. The party, after deciding to repress the practice of Falun Gong because of its beneficial to health, decided, because of the widespread popularity of Falun Gong, to flip the narrative. Instead of saying that the practice was good for health, the party started propagandizing, incredible as it may seem, that exercise was bad for health. The gist of the narrative was that the spiritual beliefs, which were coupled with the exercise, led practitioners to self-harm or harm to others, and that the people who held the spiritual beliefs of Falun Gong were accordingly insane. In an article published in 2002 in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, the authors wrote, and I quote, "By committing practitioners, the authorities send the message to the population at large that there must indeed be something wrong with Falun Gong. The government also counts on the people's drawing the conclusion that no matter what the case is with Falun Gong, one would have to be insane to try to oppose the government's will, as Falun Gong was trying to do. So that's the end of the quote. Once practitioners were detained in mental hospitals because supposedly insane, they would go through the same victimization as those detained in Communist Party detention facilities or state prisons. They would be asked to recount, renounce, and denounce Falun Gong. If they did so, they were released. If they did not, they would be tortured towards the same end. Yet torture in a mental hospital takes a different form from torture in Communist Party detention centers and state prisons. Torture in Communist Party detention centers and state prisons is physical, taking the form of beatings which avoid damaging organs. Torture in mental hospitals is chemical. Physical torture is applied only when the detainees refuse to take the medication or when medication is forcibly applied. For this 2002 report that I quoted, they say further that there's brutal torture and forced administration of antipsychotic drugs against these Falun Gong detainees in psychiatric institutions. Physical torture, similar to the mistreatment of the practitioners receive in jails and prisons, is commonplace, especially when practitioners refuse to take the medications and continue practicing the exercises in the hospital. Medications are sometimes forcibly administered through nasogastric tubes to torture and punish practitioners for not cooperating with the authorities denouncing Falun Gong. If the practitioners continue to perform the exercises in the hospital or refuse to renounce their beliefs, medical dosages are increased to as much as 5 or 6 times the initial dose until the person loses the ability to move or communicate. The medication has a wide variety of toxic effects detailed in the article. This form of psychiatric abuse continues to this day. An article which was posted on the internet February 22nd, 2023, this year, sets out a number of current cases of psychiatric abuse with Falun Gong victims. The website notes that this abuse had victims from 29 Chinese provinces, occurred not only in mental hospitals, but also in prisons and detention centers. Psychiatric abuse and organ transplant abuse appear for the perpetrators to be alternatives rather than cumulative tactics. The drugs with which victims of psychiatric abuse are forcibly injected lead to organ damage, making their organs presumably unusable for transplants. As well as in China, organs for transplants were originally, even before prisoners of conscience, sourced from prisoners sentenced to death for common crimes. That sourcing eventually was complemented by organs sourced from prisoners of conscience, also in prisons and detention centers. The institutionalization of organ sourcing through prisons and detention centers was not carried forward to mental hospitals, at least as far as I can tell. Without excluding the possibility that it has happened, I haven't come across any evidence that victims of psychiatric abuse later become victims of organ transplant abuse. So the second question I asked is, does organ transplant abuse lead to political abuse of psychiatry? And my answer is yes, there's evidence to this effect, that one leads to the other. Generally, those victims of organ transplant abuse do not survive the abuse. They are, as I've indicated, killed through organ extraction. The only possible victims of organ transplant abuse who could be subsequently victims of political abuse of psychiatry are those who survive organ transplant abuse. There's one very detailed public recorded case of that situation, the case of Deng Guangying. Her sequential victimization of organ transplant abuse and then political abuse of psychiatry had an intermediate stage, opposition to organ transplant abuse. And so I'm going to address her case in addressing the next question, the third question. So the third question is this: does opposition to organ transplant abuse lead to political abuse of psychiatry? So let me go back to Deng Guangying. She, in 2011, was setting up a stall to sell fruit on a street in Chongqing, Community 6, Jingling Village, Tuchang Town, Hoshan District in Chongqing, China. not a Falun Gong practitioner. On the evening of May 26, 2011, she was asked to pay 150,000 yuan by the town authorities, presumably for violating their street rules about setting up stalls on streets. And that's a large sum. Today it amounts to almost 20,000 euros. She refused and was arrested on May 31st of 2011. She was transferred from local detention to the Shimi Women's Forced Labor Camp in Jingbi, Chongqing, China. On September 21st, a few months later, at the labor camp, she was beaten in order to coerce her to sign an organ donation form. In the operating room, she was asked by the operating surgeon if she consented, and she protested she did not. She was nonetheless prepared for the operation. Her brother, with whom she managed to communicate and had come to the hospital, and her uncle, who was actually a party official in Chongqing, was the procurate, protested and prevented the operation from going ahead. She still retains a scar under her left eye from the start of the operation, and she was sent back to the labor camp for a year. During that year, she witnessed what happened to Xu Zhen, who was a Falun Gong practitioner from Hechuan Electric Power Company. On September 20th, 2011, a few months, actually, it was the day before Deng was sent to the labor camp. But in any case, Xu Zhen on September 21st was beaten and ordered. No. Sorry. On September 20th, Xu Zhen was arrested for distributing Falun Gong materials in Hechuan City and transferred for 2 years of forced labor to the same labor camp where Deng Guangying was detained. Deng Guangying reported that she and Xu Zhen were taken every night with others to a small room on the 4th floor of the detention building and forced to do 5,000 squats as a form of punishment or torture. At around 1 o'clock in the morning in October 20th, 2011, Deng Guangying was taken from her 3rd floor cell to a small room on the 4th floor. Xu Zhen was already there. Deng Guangying and Xu Zhen were stripped of all clothes and required to do the squatting exercises. Deng Guangying reported, and I quote, "I saw them drag Xu Zhen onto a bed, forcibly open her mouth, use an iron tool to hold it open. They then poured water and food into her. There was a policewoman named Tao Xin on the left side and female police captain on the right side. And she has the badge numbers of each of these policewomen. The 2 policewomen began drawing blood. They then started to remove the corneas, it wouldn't have been the policewomen, it would have been surgeons started to remove the corneas. While the corneas were being removed, the police ordered me to return to the prison cell. I put on my clothes, I returned to the 3rd floor, and I heard Xu Zhen screaming incessantly. At 7 in the morning, a particularly loud scream came, and then Xu Zhen shouted loudly, "They dug my eyes out while I was alive." Deng Guangying said that at that time, the cries rang out very loudly. All the 200 to 300 people in the 4th Brigade of the labor camp would have heard it if they had not slept through it. Then the scream suddenly stopped, and Xu Zhen's voice was no longer heard. Many people were awakened that night and could not sleep. By the 2nd day, everybody in the 4th Brigade concluded that Xu Zhen was dead. Everyone was crying, unable to eat, and went on a collective hunger strike. The police double teamed to beat those who refused to eat. Another person in the detention center named who was there at the same time as Deng and Xu Zhen confirmed this story. Who said that she was awakened by the screams of Xu Zhen. The police came the next day and prohibited everyone from discussing her fate. After this event, at a labor camp gathering, Deng Guangying asked to see Captain Jian of the camp, which Deng was allowed to do. At the meeting, Deng asked Captain Jian, "How much did you sell Xu Jian's organ for after cutting them out?" Captain Jian did not answer, but instead in response cried, whimpering. After release from the labor camp in September 2012, Deng petitioned the Chongqing municipal government about the organ transplant abuse she had witnessed and about other cases about which she had collected evidence. On one of these occasions, when she petitioned the local petition office, Zhu Hongliang, the petitions officer, told her that organ harvesting and trafficking was caused, generated, supervised by the Municipal Communist Party Committee and the National People's Congress Standing Committee. The petitions officer refused to do anything contrary to these authorities. Deng Guangying then went to Beijing, to the capital, to petition the national government about organ transplant abuse she had witnessed and about the other causes for which she'd collected evidence. On October 2020, 2016, the Zhuxia Fen police station in Fengtai district, Beijing, arrested Deng. She was living at the time in the Fengtai district in Beijing. She was handed over to the Chongqing liaison office in Beijing. The Chongqing liaison office in Beijing deported Deng Guangying back to Chongqing, where she originally lived. In Chongqing, she was detained at the Sanmiao Psychiatric Hospital in Hechuan district. The government of the area repeatedly asked family members to sign an agreement that she was mentally ill, that they consented to her being sent to hospital, but the family refused. The authorities said if they signed the agreement, she would be released, but they didn't believe the authorities, that they believed it would just be an excuse to detain her indefinitely. A sister of Deng managed to visit her at the local psychiatric hospital when she was initially detained. After that, all visits were refused. After the first visit, the hospital told the family members that a visit required a certificate from the local police. The local Tuchang Town Police Station has persistently refused requests for a certificate. She remains detained in this psychiatric hospital 7 years later. So that's a kind of clear connection between organ transplant abuse and opposition to psychiatric abuse. And does the fourth question is, opposition to political abuse of psychiatry lead to organ transplant abuse? Well, generally, there is a link between perceived opposition to the government and organ transplant abuse. Falun Gong is a spiritual belief and not a political doctrine. Nonetheless, Falun Gong were and are victimized systematically, including being killed for their organs because of their large numbers, which made the Communist Party fear for its supremacy, as I've mentioned. Similarly, Uyghurs and other Turkic populations have been victimized in large numbers because the Communist Party fears that the Uyghurs and other Turkic populations have been and would be insufficiently loyal to the party. Now, not every person perceived as insufficiently loyal to the party is going to be killed for their organs, yet the risk is there. Whether that insufficient loyalty manifests itself through opposition to organ transplant abuse or any other means. The fifth question is to what extent should psychiatrists work to end organ transplant abuse? And there has been an agreement between the World Psychiatric Association and the Chinese Society of Psychiatrists, not about organ transplant abuse, but about psychiatric abuse. There was a meeting in New York in May 2004 during the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting, where the World Psychiatric Association president at the time, Ahmed Akasha, and the Chinese Society of Psychiatrists president at the time, Don Fangzhou, issued a joint statement saying that the World Psychiatric Association acknowledges that the Chinese Society of Psychiatrists has cooperated in a 3-year investigation of alleged psychiatric abuses of Falun Gong members who were sent to Chinese psychiatric hospitals and clinics. The Chinese Society of Psychiatrists investigation identified instances in which some Chinese psychiatrists failed to distinguish between spiritual cultural beliefs and delusions, as a result of which persons were misdiagnosed and mistreated. The statement attributed these acts to lack of training and professional skills of some psychiatrists rather than to systematic abuse of psychiatry. In addition, the Chinese Society of Psychiatrists agreed to take steps to educate its members about the issues that led to misdiagnosis and mistreatment, and said it welcomed the World Psychiatric's assistance in correcting the situation and improving psychiatric diagnosis and treatment to the People's Republic of China. The comment of Harold East at the time, a psychiatrist, was that it represents real progress in preventing further abuses of psychiatry in China and will lead to a higher quality of care. Now, what I would point out here is that the investigation to which these statements refer were Chinese Society of Psychiatry investigations, not World Psychiatric Association investigations. And there's a statement that progress has been made, and basically what the World Psychiatric Association was doing is relying on what the Chinese Society of Psychiatrists was saying. And it doesn't deal specifically, I mean, it doesn't deal at all with organ transplant abuse, but it's useful as an indication of the problems that you would get and what the transplant profession has gotten in dealing with transplant abuse. And let me illustrate that by going on to the next few questions. The sixth question is, to what extent should transplant professionals work to end political abuse of psychiatry? Well, my answer to that is ideally there should be solidarity. After all, psychiatrists and transplant professionals are specialists within an overall medical profession. The medical profession has umbrella organizations where the two can work together. The World Medical Association member organizations are national medical associations. Transplant professionals and psychiatrists can work together in any of these national associations for joint effort, which they can bring in turn to the World Medical Association. So that I would suggest should be done. And so then the seventh question is, what can those combating organ transplant abuse learn from the effort to combat political abuse of psychiatry? I would say that 2004 agreement is not anything from which the organ transplant, those combating organ transplant abuse can learn, but there's a prior effort of the World Psychiatric Association, which I think is instructive. In 1977, the World Psychiatric Association condemned the Soviet Union by resolution for its abuse of psychiatry. The Soviets withdrew from the association in 1983 when it faced almost certain expulsion. The World Psychiatric Association eventually agreed in 1989 to readmit the Soviet Union, provided four conditions were met. They were that the Soviet Psychiatric Association acknowledged that systematic abuse of psychiatry for political purposes had taken place. Now, as you can tell, the 2004 acknowledgement didn't acknowledge, they acknowledged abuse, but it said it was misdiagnosis, not political. Second, that they promised to discontinue to abuse. Three, they rehabilitate the victims. Again, the 2004 agreement said nothing about rehabilitation. Four, they democratize the psychiatric association, which again, the 2004 agreement said nothing about that. The conditions were conditions subsequent, not conditions precedent. The Soviet Union was readmitted pending fulfillment of conditions with a monitoring committee to set up to monitor fulfillment of the conditions. If the conditions were fulfilled, membership would become unconditional. If they were not, membership would be suspended. But in the meantime, the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991. The World Congress of Psychiatry meets every 3 years. Its next meeting after establishing Soviet Union conditional membership was scheduled for 1992. Membership of the Soviet Union and the World Psychiatric Association remained conditional until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, since the World Congress never had a meeting to reconsider the issue of unconditional Soviet membership. Okay, so what can the last question is what can those combating political abuse of psychiatry learn from the effort to combat organ transplant abuse? Well, I would say there's something good lessons and bad lessons. There have been some notable developments within the transplant profession standing up against transplant abuse in China. The Transplantation Society Ethics Committee policy statement, Chinese Transplantation Program and Mission Statement of November 2006 provided that, and I quote, almost all organs from China are likely to have been obtained from executed prisoners, and that, and I quote, presentation of studies involving patient data or samples from recipients of organs or tissues from executed prisoners should not be accepted. But that was 2006. More recently, the Canadian Society of Nephrology and Organ Trafficking issued a policy statement in September 2021, which provides, and I quote, patients should be educated regarding. This is the Canadian statement, not the international statement. The international statement, the Canadian statement was 2011. The Canadian statement was that patients should be educated regarding the unethical treatment of individuals who sell their organs for money in unregulated systems in the developing world. Physicians have a duty to advocate for their patients, but as members of the medical community, they also have a duty to prevent harm to individuals. Patients should be educated about the harms that may come to those who provide organs through transplant tourism. Now, this statement is interesting, but of course, I mean, there's transplant tourism from many countries into China, but there's not, to my knowledge, psychiatric tourism, psychiatric patients from countries into China. So that sort of policy, although it shows the awareness of the profession and the willingness to combat it, doesn't have an immediate practical effect in terms of counseling patients not to go to China for psychiatric help, because mostly would be the situation would not occur where that would be relevant. More relevant is what the Transplantation Society did in 2014. They, in 2014, refused to allow 35 Chinese participants for ethical reasons to attend the World Transplant Conference in San Francisco in July of that year. For October 2014, there was a transplant conference in Hangzhou, China, with many invited overseas transplant experts who generally, pretty systematically failed to attend. And that had an impact on the profession. There was in April 22, an International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation statement, which is also useful. They wrote that given the body of evidence that the government of the People's Republic of China stands alone in continuing to systematically support the procurement of organs or tissue from executed prisoners, submissions related to transplantation and involving either organs or tissue from human donors in the People's Republic of China will not be accepted for presentation or publication. But unfortunately, I mean, these are positive examples, but they are the exception rather than the rule. And indeed, the transplantation profession today, for the most part, has developed the way the psychiatric profession did in 2004, not investigating, taking Chinese at their word, saying that there's change when the only change is that they said something that the outsiders wanted to hear. The current position of the Transplantation Society and much of the transplantation profession worldwide is encapsulated in an exchange between the United States House of Representative Chris Smith and former Transplant Society President Francis Delmonico in a June 2016 House subcommittee hearing, where I was also a witness. And so Representative Smith asked this question: in 2016, how do you independently verify Chinese government claims that there's no transplant abuse when there's been such a backdrop of terrible duplicity, lies, and deception on the part of this government? Trust and verify. How do you do that? So Dr. Delmonico answered, I'm not an apologist. I'm not up here to tell you not to worry. I'm not here to verify. That's not my job. I'm here to say to you that there's a move within the country to change. So the statement of Dr. Delmonico, I'm not here to verify. That's not my job. It's glib. Health professionals cannot be expected to be experts in every field relevant to their profession. Yet, even if that is so, the ignorant should defer to the knowledgeable. The amateurs should defer to the experts. Those who've done the research should defer to those who have not done the research should defer to those who have. Iconoclasm can come from any direction, yet there's always room for disrupting the consensus. Yet that disruption should be familiar with the sources and be able to question them. So the shrug of the shoulders, the pretense that all is well, is not a challenge to research. It is self-delusion, willful blindness. The last of the 10 stages of genocide is denial. The Chinese Communist Party denies the mass killing of innocents through organ extraction, which the evidence establishes. That denial takes the form of personal insults directed against those who've done the research, fabricated statistics which are easily contradicted, or telling foreigners what they want to hear, no matter how divorced from reality those words are. There are all too many health professionals who take the Chinese Communist Party assertions of denial of reality as real. The problem here is not just ignorance, since no one can be expected to know everything, but active endorsement of a cover-up of genocide. To quote Dr. Delmonico again, his statement, I'm here to say to you that there's a move within the country to change, fails to take into account what the change in reality is, an evolving cover-up of organ transplant abuse. And one can say the same of psychiatric abuse. So I have a few recommendations. One is, I think that the World Psychiatric Association, National Psychiatric Association, individual psychiatrists, governments should be asking for the release of Deng Guangying from psychiatric detention in China. I would also recommend that the World Psychiatric Association abandon the 2004 agreement. It has not been respected, and it was mistaken in the first place. I would recommend that the Psychiatrists Association in any and every country join with their transplant professionals in bringing to the World Medical Association concerns about both psychiatric abuse and transplant abuse in China. I would urge that psychiatric publications have the same sort of policy about publications and meetings and congresses and presentations and conferences that the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation has, which anything is emanating from China where the sourcing is not independently clear, that the sourcing comes from evidence that is untainted by abuse, should be denied. And the fifth point I would mention is that within the United Nations system, there's something, the Human Rights Council, there's something called the Universal Periodic Review, where every country comes up for review every few years. China is coming up for review again in 2024 in January, and I would suggest everyone should be asking their governments in their statements at the Universal Periodic Review to raise the issue of psychiatric abuse, political abuse of psychiatry, and organ transplant abuse with prisoners of conscience victims in their statement in the Universal Periodic Review. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And now if anybody wants to make questions, it's a really difficult topic. If nobody does, I will pose some question.
Well, I'd love to ask a question. Thank you for your presentation. It's really painful to listen to many of the events that you do articulate. I'm thinking from the perspective of what I've had to experience as a psychological professional in Venezuela, and detailing some psychiatric abuse there. That one of the challenges that you mentioned is being able to overcome the disbelief that these things have happened. It's not only hard to challenge the professional organizations to look into, but also to challenge kind of the complete disbelief in other areas of the world where it's hard to think that these things are possible. I just wanted to hear your comments on having to deal with something that is found to be so terrible that it's met commonly with disbelief.
Well, indeed, that's a common problem, and I would say this is a common problem with all mass atrocities. I mean, this was a problem with the Holocaust. While the Holocaust was happening at the death camps, there was people who were escaping and telling other people what was happening. I mean, Rudolf Verba had escaped from Auschwitz and had a plan of Auschwitz. He showed great detail, everything was happening. And he'd go and he'd tell people this was happening. Some of them believed him and fled. Some of them didn't believe it, stayed, and then were killed in the Holocaust. And it's particularly difficult when you're dealing with the medical abuse, whether psychiatry, organ transplant, because these the psychiatric developments or the transplant developments weren't developed to kill people. I mean, it's easier to believe that a more advanced machine gun is going to kill people than a more advanced organ transplant abuse. But the reality is technology is morally neutral. Even if the inventors intended it for good purposes, the mere fact of their intent doesn't change the fact that the technology itself has no moral content. It's only the people who use it who do. And if the people who use it want to use it for their own purposes, for wrongdoing purposes, it's certainly hard. I think one has to develop an awareness beyond your own boundaries or beyond your own neighborhood. But also, I would say, you can't wait for somebody to come to you to kill you for your organs, or to throw you in a psychiatric detention center because they think, because of your abuse, that the only way you're going to escape the abuse is to stop it while it happens to somebody else. And indeed, with organ transplant abuse, that's what happened. I mean, originally it was just prisoners sentenced to death, and then it was, after that, in large numbers, just Falun Gong, and much more recently it was Uyghurs. If it had been stopped when it was Falun Gong, the Uyghurs would never have suffered. And the human rights violations spread unless they're stopped. Don't stop. There's a theologian, Roald Neighbor, who said, I didn't protest when they were going after this group because I wasn't one of them, and so on. And then they came to me, and there was nobody left to protest. And I think that's a point that has to be made. Oh, and here's a written question. I can't unmute. What do you think about the fact that, let me get that up in the, can somebody maybe read that out, or there's a chat question there.
Yes, Artin is asking if, here's in the report, what do you think about the fact that as long as coercive measures are allowed in mental health acts, the abuse politically or socially will there be too?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, that he's asking, as long as there are coercive acts in mental health, the political and social abuse is gonna continue.
Well, sure. We're dealing with human nature, and technology develops, but human nature remains much the same. The capacity to do harm and the capacity to good remain the same. The issue is not whether we're going to eradicate all wrongdoing in the world. The issue is the extent. The issue is whether it's going to be greater or lesser. And what we're involved in is I would say, not an elimination of all possible abuse. It's a matter of minimization, and we can do more than we are doing. And I think we should do everything possible to minimize the abuse, with the realization that, given the frailty of humanity, we can't make a perfect world.
Yeah, this goes hand in hand with the question that I had. It's mental health will support people to talk about the traumas they are living or they have vicariously lived through other people in their network, or if the system of mental health is there to stop them from talking, that's just not allows for this problem to stop. That I guess it's the sense that, and here the question, do we have outside China the networks to support people that comes and could talk about what is going on? Do the professionals acknowledge that this is happening and provide the support, do not deny what they are talking about, etc., and provide the environment to talk about this safely over here, not in China, which I guess it's completely out of the question?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, that's a professional question within the psychiatric framework, which I'm not really able to answer. But I think there is another aspect of it, which is transnational repression. I mean, one of the problems we face, which many governments face, democratic governments face, is that these repressive governments are not just repressive at home. They make every effort to extend repression abroad, and in a variety of different ways. I mean, sometimes there's extraterritorial assassinations, but even when it's less than that, there's threatening of relatives back home. There's harassment and intimidation through internet and email. I mean, I myself, I've been working on this organ transplant file since 2006, and I've had meetings canceled, a lot of them at the last minute, usually for some reason that has nothing to do with China, but the meetings that aren't canceled, they tell me that the Chinese government has asked for cancellation, or some Chinese government front association. There's through the internet, I had a death threat, which thankfully didn't materialize. There was a drive-by shooting of a host to one of my events, which they attributed to hosting my event, and some bullet holes in the window. And and there's this constant effort, and I think, well, people should feel free to talk about their experiences once they get out of China or out of these repressive environments. But in order to do that, I mean, we have to go beyond more than providing a welcoming environment for them to do so. We have to actively combat transnational repression, which intimidates them, terrorizes them, and tries to shut them up. So that was my answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if you would like to say, how is the situation right now? It's getting worse, as far as you're aware, in Xinjiang.
Well, Xinjiang is in a terrible situation because there's genocide in more than one way. There's a mass killing of practitioners through their organs, but there's also a separation of children from their parents, which is another form of genocide. There's an active attempt through this separation to indoctrinate children, and then of course there's massive forced labor, and many of the goods that are exported from China around the world. If you go down the supply chain, a lot of it comes from Xinjiang. So that's certainly an issue there. And in terms of organ transplant abuse, in some ways, it's the situation is more is a bit different, because, as I mentioned, with Falun Gong, they were everywhere, and the local hospitals were able to source organs locally, whereas the Uyghurs and the other Turk minorities are mainly in Xinjiang. And and so initially, because of ischemic time, the time that the organ remains alive outside the body was relatively short. It was impractical to move organs around within China, but through technological development since 2006, ischemic time has been lengthened through better refrigeration techniques, liquid immersions of organs, ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machines, as a result of which organs from Xinjiang can be shipped throughout China. And one thing we can see, which we didn't see with Falun Gong, is airport lanes in Xinjiang, which say reserved for transplant of organs. I mean, we got pictures of them in many languages, of these airport lanes. And also we got media reports of organs being shipped from Xinjiang around China. I mean, the Chinese government, or the transplant profession is involved in a kind of a double game. On the one hand, they're trying to promote and boast about their transplant profession as modern, up to date, in order to, because they're selling organs, and they want to promote sales. And on the other hand, they're trying to cover up the abuse, and it's very difficult to both publicize what they're doing and cover up what they're doing at one and the same time, which it makes both kind of awkward. But what we see, and what I see, is a rolling cover-up. So a lot of the statistics I used to quote, I mean, we've archived them, but the statistical series stops after we quote them. And I mean, the government will deny things and their spokespeople will deny things they've said, even though we have them. We've actually got them on video, recorded, archived, saying them. And frankly, I would say that this World Psychiatric Association Agreement 2004 manifests all the troubles we see with outsiders dealing with China, letting and not making their own investigations, taking them at their word, thinking there's progress simply because people say the Chinese say what the outsiders want to hear, and that problem, of course, is it's real for all of China, but it's particularly acute for China because so much effort is being poured into China. I mean, Falun Gong is still, I mean, the Falun Gong problem hasn't gone away, and it never received the publicity that Uyghur did, partly because Uyghur are Muslim, and Islam is relatively is certainly better known than Falun Gong. It's a spiritual belief, partly because there's an ethnic differentiation with the Uyghurs, which there isn't with Falun Gong. Falun Gong are all just Han Chinese, pretty much. Although subsequently, since the repression, it's spread around the world, and there's practitioners in different countries. And I expect in all of the countries in which members of the audience come from. But the fact of this geographic location, this ethnic identification, this easily identifiable religious identification, makes the Uyghur repression a lot more visible than some of the other repressions we see in China, including Falun Gong, but they're all equally troublesome.
Yeah, indeed. And from outside the profession of psychiatry as well, like a layman, Falun Gong may be an easier target just because it's a weird belief system, if you want to paint it like that, which is what they have achieved. Like, they humanized the whole collective. Correct me if I'm mistaken. And
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, yeah, I mean, this is a problem. The words Falun Gong don't mean anything in other languages besides Chinese, the Chinese languages. And so people don't, you know, when the Chinese government says Islam is this or Islam is this, people know better because they know Islam. But when the Chinese government says Falun Gong is this, Falun Gong is that, well, people don't normally read through the spiritual texts of Falun Gong, and all they see is this debate. They see somebody say X and somebody else say Y. They don't know what's true, and so they just figure it's just they walk away from it because they can't be bothered sorting it out. But and that to a certain extent makes Falun Gong more vulnerable. I mean, again with the Tibetan Buddhists, I mean they're very heavily victimized also. But people know Buddhism, they know Tibet, they know Tibetans as a distinct ethnic group, so it's easier to pick up on. And I think that simply because you don't know, you shouldn't be prepared to say, well, maybe there's something on either side. I mean, one has to look at the Communist Party record, which is terrible. I mean, the persecution of Falun Gong and Uyghurs are not the first set of persecutions in the history of the Communist Party. I mean, it's got a long, terrible history, and it's basically a continuation of the same people in charge with the same operation for working, speaking, propagandizing, and one has to take that into account. I mean, China. I mean, every country has its own distinctiveness, and China is definitely very different from the rest of the world. And one has to appreciate those differences to understand what's going on in China.
Yeah, and to contextualize, with Tiananmen victims of the repression, they could still be labeled as dissidents and therefore be imprisoned, unexecuted, organs harvested, trafficked, etc., within the law, despite they denying it at that time. I am right about that. Yet in Falun Gong wave, that cannot be justified in the exterior, outside. It's way too hard to say spiritual beliefs do not align with our. It's a growing community that can become dangerous to us. This is the context.
Yes, partly. When it came to killing of prisoners sentenced to death for their organs, the Chinese said it was legal because A, they were going to be executed anyways, and B, these people, so they said, all donated their organs before they died to atone for the crimes they committed. That was their official line, which they eventually abandoned. I mean, eventually they said they were stopped sourcing organs from prisoners. But when it came to the killing, and they also have a 1984 law, which has never been repealed, which says that they are allowed to source organs from prisoners without the consent of their families, provided the bodies are unclaimed. But they've also changed the law, saying without repealing the old law, saying there has to be consent, there can't be any payment, you're supposed to give priority to locals over foreigners. They've never banned Falun Gong. They've never admitted they've been sourcing organs from Falun Gong. They've never justified it as legal. But in China, the party controls the prosecution, the investigation, the police, the defense bar, the courts. They even have judicial committees which sit outside of court, where the party runs the judicial committees to decide the cases heard in court. I mean, so the legal system it isn't really a legal system like we see in the rest of the world. It's just an organ of party rule to provide one more facet of party rule. And a lot of some of the laws are enforced, but some aren't. And they certainly don't enforce the law against the party because the party runs the whole legal system. So the psychiatric abuse system, the organ transplant abuse system, may be legal in parts, maybe illegal in parts, but it doesn't really matter because the party's running it and they don't care what the law says because they run the law.
Thank you, David. Really appreciated to have you here.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. Manuel, I give you the word now. Te paso el relevo. If you don't mind, I'll just skip the presentation. You go ahead and we maximize the time that we have here. Yeah?
Perfect.